Hello, and welcome to the June 2012 Security Webcast. I'm Dustin Childs, Group Manager for Response Communications, and this is Jonathan Ness, Security Development Manager for Trustworthy Computing.
Hello everyone, thanks for joining us.
So we've got a big month ahead of us, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go through the June bulletins and talk about those. We have a security advisory to discuss as well that we released yesterday. And we also talk about some important changes to how we handle certificates. We'll, of course, as always, include what's new in the malicious software removal tool for this month, and we'll take your questions. So as always, we have a room full of people down the hallway who are waiting to answer your questions. We already have a couple questions in, and that's fantastic. So if you already have questions, you can go ahead and start submitting them now. You don't have to wait. Go ahead and get those in. That gives us some more time to make sure we have a good answer for you. We're also taking questions through Twitter if you prefer, and if you would like to do that, please tweet your question with the hashtag #MSFTSecWebcast. That's all one word, and I am monitoring Twitter closely to make sure we get all of our social media contacts accounted for. So let's go ahead and get started. This month we have 7 bulletins to cover, addressing 26 unique CVEs. And if we take a look at our severity and exploitability index, like I said, we have 7 bulletins, 3 of which are critical, and 2 of those, which are MS-12036 and MS-12037, are our top priorities for deployments this month. They both have an exploitability index rating of 1, and of the other 5, 1 is rated critical and 4 are rated important. And overall, everything has a cumulative exploitability index of 1. That means out of at least one of the CVEs in every bulletin, we expect to see exploit code written and made public within the next 30 days.
Yeah, there's 3 criticals there, but the top 2 are really the most important ones to look at this month, and we'll talk about why in the slides going forward here.
Okay. We have a couple of unusual entries that we don't always see.
True.
Lync is addressed by itself. We don't always see that, and that's MS-12039. And we have a newcomer, which is MS-12040. That's unusual for us because it's a Dynamics AX bulletin, important class severity. And that's the first time we've had that product group join us for a bulletin on Update Tuesday. So moving on to the deployment slide, there's MS-12037 and MS-12036 at the top of our deployment list. MS-12037 is our IE bulletin this month, and it includes a total of 10 issues, 8 of which are critical class. It's not the biggest IE bulletin in our history, but it's certainly not small either. So Jonathan, are there any CVEs, particularly within this IE bulletin, that really stand out to you?
Yeah, there's one that's actually, we've seen some limited attacks in the wild right now, so we'll cover that, but that's really why we urge you to look at that IE update as one of the top priorities this month to address the limited attacks we see in the wild.
Okay, great. Our other priority 1 bulletin this month is MS-12036, which covers a critical class issue in remote desktop protocol. Now, I know, Jonathan, you and I and several others have had some discussions over the last few days. It's like, of these 2 priority 1 bulletins, which one should we encourage customers to really roll with first, RDP or IE? And we put IE on top. So let's talk about that a little more. Is it just the attack surface area that IE affords? Is it the active attacks? What really is it that pushes IE over RDP?
Yeah, I guess each customer might have a different priority in their environment. To me, if I were running a network, I would look at the active attacks in the wild as being the thing that puts the IE bulletin up top. You know, with the RDP bulletin, boy, that attack surface is significant, and it's something to address for sure as well. But we just don't see any active attacks in the wild right now for that RDP vulnerability. So, I mean, I would recommend the IE update, but maybe for some enterprises, if they aren't using IE as much and they do have RDP exposed as attack surface to the internet or to untrusted user, that RDP thing would be higher for them. It just depends on the customer.
Fantastic, great. And after those 2, the list is relatively straightforward. We have MS-12038, 39, and 40, which are all our priority 2 bulletins. And we have 2 priority 3 Windows bulletins at the bottom of the list, and we'll get a closer look at those in a minute. But let's go ahead and start with the RDP bulletin, which is MS-12036.
Okay.
It addresses a single critical class issue in remote desktop protocol. And this is one of our deployment 1 priorities. And the attack scenario for here is we have a remote unauthenticated attacker who could exploit this vulnerability by sending specially crafted packets to the RDP server. So besides RDP not being enabled by default, even though we know it's widely deployed, what are some other interesting things about this bulletin, Jonathan?
Yeah, we addressed an RDP vulnerability a couple of months ago with MS-12020, and we really made a push to customers at that time to enable this workaround we called NLA, or network level authentication. That introduces an additional step in the protocol. Before you get to the point where the vulnerable code could be triggered, it requires the client to authenticate to the server first. So that moves this unauthenticated or pre-authentication vulnerability, remote vulnerability, to a post-authentication remote vulnerability, which is significantly less severe, because you'd have to authenticate as a RDP user in order to trigger the vulnerability, which would lessen the severity. So we really encourage customers, if they're able to enable that NLA or network level authentication, that would be fantastic. There is one kind of gotcha in that. In order to make that work for XP and Windows Server 03 clients, you'll have to install an additional package on the client in order to it turns on that NLA feature for the client side. So if you have if you are using just Vista and later clients, man, just enable that thing, and that'll move this and the past RDP vulnerabilities to a post-auth scenario. If you're using a lot of XP and Server 03 as clients, you'll need to first go and get that package on your clients.
And that package that you refer to for XP in 2003, you can go look at MS-12020 and find all the details on that, especially documented in the Known Issues at the KB article, right?
Yep, that's right.
And while we're on this, the question we get asked every month is there anything wormable? So for this one, I think we have an answer, right?
Yeah, this could lend itself to a internet wormable style attack, because it's the kind of the key factors that go into that remote network-based pre-authentication, and then tick 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 for this guy. With the last vulnerability, MS-12020, we were concerned about that, and we didn't see attacks come out of that. That was a double free vulnerability, so it was a difficult one to exploit. We saw some progress in the attacker community, but no one got. We saw some denial of service style proof of concept code posted, but we never did see a remote code execution exploit for that. This one, it might be a little bit easier to exploit than the last one. This is a use after free instead of a double free, so it might be a little bit easier to trigger. It'll be a timing issue, though, so it's not a walk in the park to build an exploit for this one either.
Well, that's good news to hear, but we do give it the exploit index of 1, which means that it's definitely possible, and we definitely expect to see a lot of work in this area.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I guess I'd point out one more thing we kind of skimmed over. The XP, really the client-side exposure for this one, for XP and Vista and Win7 client, is moderate. It's not the same remote code execution vulnerability is not. It comes across a little differently on the client side, so we rated it moderate. It's still something you should apply on the clients as well, but there's no remote RCE unauthenticated vector on the client side. It's a little bit of a different bug in how it shows up.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So let's move on and talk about our Internet Explorer bulletin this month, and this one is big enough that we've given it 2 whole slides. So as you can see here, we've got quite a few CVEs that we're addressing, from moderate to critical severity. So we're not going to take time and walk you through every single one. I do want to call out a couple of them, though. CVE 2012-1876 shares CVE 2012-1858 with the Lync bulletin, which is important. So we mentioned one is under active attack right now. That's CVE 2012-1875. That's under, let me be very clear, under targeted attack right now. We're not seeing it widespread, but we are seeing attacks on that. For CVE 2012-1874, an attacker would have to make users visit the website and open the Internet Explorer developer toolbar, which is the first time I've even heard of that, Jonathan. Is there anything you can tell me about the IE developer toolbar?
Yeah, you got to hit F12 when you're running IE. So if you ever see a web page that says hit F12,
Right.
don't do it.
Don't do it. Okay. So F12 on web page is bad. I'll just put that in my note of things to know. And also, I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly which of the CVEs, but the pwn to own exploit we're addressing this month too. So back in March at the CanSec conference, I think it was in March, there was an issue that was reported then exploiting Internet Explorer for the pwn to own competition. We're addressing that this month. So if we look at the second slide of this bulletin, then we can see further that there are a couple of mitigating factors. The biggest one, of course, was for the CVE where you have to hit F12.
Right.
Again, don't do that. And one important mitigating factor to me whenever we talk about IE bulletins is no one can force you to browse to a web page, right? You can't just make your browser go from one page to another. Excuse me, you have to click on a link somewhere. And I also wanted to note that for supported versions of the server-side operating systems, we've got a lower severity there too, and that's through the Enhanced Security Configuration Mode, ESC. Jonathan, is there anything you wanted to add on about ESC?
I mean, it just disables script by default on server platforms. So, you know, these vulnerabilities, the typical use after free vulnerabilities, you got to have script enabled in order to trigger those vulnerabilities. So, on server platforms by default, we just turn that off, lowering the severity.
Great, and that's another thing when we talk about defense in depth too, especially on server platforms. Critical infrastructure, critical servers, even your not so critical servers. You want to make sure that you're not just allowing users to log on and run programs, things like that. If you're browsing the web from your server, probably not the best idea. That's one of the reasons we set that as default. So moving on to our next bulletin, we have a .NET bulletin that's MS12038. This is a deployment priority of 2 for us. We address 1 CVE, and this is also the last critical bulletin of this month. Now, we did re-release MS12025, but there's no relationship between these two .NET bulletins. As I recall, there's no bulletin supersedence for this .NET bulletin at all. So you can roll those bulletins out in either order if you want to do 3825 or 2538.
Okay.
And the possible attack vector for this is you have, as usual with a lot of .NET apps, .NET vulnerabilities, you have a XAML browser application or an XBAP that's used, and you have to force a user with an affected version of .NET to go to a malicious web page where you have a malicious XBAP set up. Is that correct, Jonathan?
That's right, and I have good news. On IE9, we disabled that functionality altogether.
Great.
And IE8 and downloadable browsers, we actually disabled it in the internet zone. So you can't just browse to a malicious website with any version of IE right now and in the internet zone and have this vulnerability triggered. The place where we still have it on is in the intranet zone.
Okay.
So, I mean, even on the Microsoft corporate network, we use these kind of applets or XBAPs to do business logic applications. But, you know, in order to trigger that, someone would have to get onto our CorpNet and set up a website, set up the malicious XBAP, and then lure CorpNet users to that. So disabling the internet zone XBAP execution, I think, is a good thing to do. I'm glad we did it.
I agree. That was one of my bulletins that actually released that. So that was MS11044, where we included that defense in-depth mitigation into it. So if you're quite a bit behind and are still looking or testing MS11044 or one of the bulletins that has replaced it, definitely consider that in your prioritization as well, because it has additional features for defense in-depth mitigations. So moving on now to MS12039, this is Lync, which is another deployment priority of 2. We have 4 CVEs here, and that shares CVE 2012-1858 with the IE bulletin. And overall, this is really, when we're talking about this bulletin, we're talking about another DLL preloading, and that's what brings in the remote code execution. So we've done quite a few of those. I've done quite a few of those. It's still a relatively unlikely scenario, right, Jonathan?
Yeah, I can kind of go through the attack vector. So what an attacker would do is set up a WebDAV share or an SMB share and lure you to go there with Explorer. So it's not even browse to a website. It's lure you to a WebDAV share or some UNC path like that. On that share, they would put 2 files. For this particular vulnerability, it would be a .ocsmeet file. This is a Lync registered file extension, and they put a malicious DLL. They trick you into double-clicking on the file. In this case, it's ocsmeet file. And while Lync loads the current working directory where it loads DLLs from, it would search in that WebDAV share, or in that UNC path, for the DLLs it needs, and it would pick up this malicious DLL and load it. So there's a few steps. The reason you're saying it's not as we don't see attacks as widely, because they got to lure you to a WebDAV share, and you have to double-click on something bad on the WebDAV share. So we don't see it as much in the wild.
Right. There's
thankfully.
a lot of user interaction there.
Right.
There's some social engineering that has to occur. Now, there is one other CVE here that's involved in information disclosure, and that what sort of information could possibly be disclosed through that bug?
Yeah, actually there's 4 CVEs in this one. The DLL preloading one is a new one. Mm-hmm. The other 3 CVEs are really, we've addressed them in other products previously. So there was a font parsing issue that we addressed a few times in different products that we found through our clone code detection system. We found the malicious code, not malicious code, we found vulnerable code in the Lync client, sorry.
Yes, let's be very clear, we found some vulnerable code, not malicious code in the Lync client.
It's font parsing code. The thing is that we were theorizing, okay, how could an attacker get a malicious font to you? We didn't see a clear attack vector, but there's vulnerable code there that we're addressing. So that's where the 2 font related CVEs come in. And then another, the 4th, let's see, I'm not sure where in the list it is here, but the other vulnerability being addressed was also previously addressed in other products as well. It's a safe HTML bypass vulnerability, and we took that same fix from other products and addressed it in the Lync vulnerability in the Lync product as well.
Great. And if you look at the exploitability index for the particular CVEs within this bulletin, you'll notice that only one of the CVEs has an XI of 1, and everything else is an XI of 3. I know for our investigation, there was definitely a lot of discussion as to how an attacker, like you said, how would an attacker actually get something there? So that's why we have the XI of 3 for some of those CVEs, and that means that we do not expect to see active exploits or available proof of concept code within the next 30 days.
Yeah, just because three of those 4 CVEs are there's vulnerable code there, but it's like you're saying, it's less likely to result in real world exploitation. Okay.
So let's go ahead and talk about our newcomer this month, which is MS12 04040. That's Dynamics AX, excuse me. So we have one CVE, and this is a cross-site scripting issue. One thing I especially want to point out here is the update for this is not actually on Windows Update. It's available through the Download Center and through the Dynamics portals. It also applies only to Dynamics AX 2012 Enterprise portal. So now, Jonathan, my question on this one, and I haven't read this bulletin too closely, if we're talking about a cross-site scripting, I normally equate that to information disclosure and not elevation of privilege.
Yeah.
How does this one actually work out?
Sure, yeah. How it would work out, an attacker would target like an admin on the Microsoft Dynamics portal. And if you're not running Microsoft Dynamics, you can kind of tune out for the next few seconds here. But they send a link to that admin, an email or IM or however they want to do it. If the admin were to click on that link from the attacker, there's script embedded in the link. So that script can execute actions in the context of that admin. So if there's something that the attacker wants done on the Dynamics server, and they can find an admin to send the link to, and they can trick them into clicking the link, it's really, we call it elevation of privilege because it's elevating from nobody, the attacker, to the Dynamics user.
To the Dynamics user.
Because it's executing a script in the context of that Dynamics user.
So again, it sounds like a lot of social engineering potentially involved here. You've got to find the right person logged on at the right time and get them to click the right thing in order for things to go out.
It'd probably be more targeted to a specific person that you know is using a Dynamics product. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So we've got 2 more to go, and both of them are somewhat related. We'll start with MS12 041, which is a vulnerability in kernel mode drivers, which could allow local authenticated users to elevate their privilege. We've got a total of 5 CVEs here, all of them rated important, all of them with an overall XI of 1. And these, again, I look at these and go, this is primarily a user who has the ability to log on and then run a specially crafted program.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
It'd be, these kind of elevation of privilege vulnerabilities would be good if a user wants to get more access than the admin has granted them. So you have to already be able to run code on a box in order to trigger this vulnerability, or these vulnerabilities, or the ones we're going to talk about in the next slide here.
Right.
I mean, I guess it could be part of a blended attack where you trigger something else and then you use this to elevate, but on its own, you can't just go from browse to a website or something like that and trigger these vulnerabilities.
Right, and that's one of the reasons that we've listed these as the deployment priority of 3. And the next one, MS12042, is very similar to this. This is a vulnerability in Windows kernel, which could allow an elevation of privilege. And again, it's a local elevation of privilege. One interesting thing to me is there's no Vista or 2008 in this bulletin. We have everything else. Now, so I know the difference, Jonathan, but I know some people I've talked to are very confused. Let's kind of go over it real quickly. What's the difference between Windows kernel and Windows kernel mode drivers?
Well,
because it sounds, I mean, we've got exploits that sound very similar. We've got attack scenarios that sound very similar. We've got components that sound very similar. But in truth, they're different components.
Sure. Like the kernel, really the NTOS kernel itself is the heart of the system. It's where things get processes are scheduled, and it's the abstraction layer of the hardware. The drivers, they're also running at the same privilege level, and that's why they're comparable vulnerabilities. But it's not the system itself, I guess I would say. This is win32k.sys that handles some user interaction stuff on the system. It's not the kernel itself, but probably it's not. Might be kind of splitting hairs for most people because the attack surface is the same, the result is the same. You can't turn off win32k.sys, you can't turn off the kernel.
Right.
So I would kind of think of them as about the same. You know, we listed one before the other, but they're probably about even.
They're about even, and like you said, they allow the attacker the same privilege if they're exploited.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So let's move on and talk about the advisory we released yesterday as well. So we have Security Advisory 2716915, and this is a vulnerability in Microsoft XML core services that could allow remote code execution. So we have a fix-it available for this, for IE, and we also recommend EMIT, which is let me see if I remember the acronym right, the Enhanced Mitigation Experience Toolkit?
Yes, good job.
Nice. That's that Air Force training coming in. So the issue here, if exploited, would allow remote code execution. And I know your team is working on an SRD blog post later to really go in depth to what the fix-it does.
That's right. Yeah, this the workaround. The workaround really introduces a fix. So this is an issue that just recently came in. We weren't able to get the comprehensive security update into the June update cycle. So we're like, man, we've got to do something to protect customers. So we built this app-compat shim that the Windows really has a good architecture for allowing this. What the shim architecture allows is anytime a process is loaded, it asks this app-compat shim architecture, are there any differences to behavior that you want me to run? And this was introduced. Boy, it was a number of Windows releases ago because some older applications wouldn't run on the new versions of Windows. So like, wow, they need to be able to change the behavior of these third-party applications so that they run on Windows. So we use this architecture to build just a tiny tweak to what happens inside the Internet Explorer process when it's loaded. We change how this vulnerability is a uninitialized variable. So when IE loads, we go to this specific code path with this shim, and where it would go just instruction, we jump off, we initialize the variable, and we jump back. So it just introduces a few assembly instructions into the MS-XML process space when it's loaded inside Internet Explorer. So as Dustin said, we're going to have a blog post a little bit later that talks more about how it works and more about the vulnerability. But this is a vulnerability that's being exploited in the wild. We've seen some limited attacks, so we encourage you to take the steps listed in the advisory, I guess, which would be either run EMIT or apply this fix-it tool.
Right, and the other thing I wanted to mention about the fix-it is the fix-it itself doesn't require a reboot.
Right.
So you can apply it to your system without having to reboot anything. I think you have to restart IE, but you don't have to reboot the entire server or the workstation or whatever.
Right.
And of course, the advisory 2719615 has all the additional details if you want some additional information about that.
I'd imagine people probably have some more questions about this, so go ahead and just send those in, and we'll answer them as soon as we get through a few more of these slides.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So another change that we announced yesterday was a KB knowledge base article 2677070. And this is one thing that we've kind of been working on for a little bit, and we're improving the process by which customers interact with untrusted or compromised certificates and keys. So in the past, if we go back a little ways to like DigiNotar, when we had some unauthorized certificates that were out there in the wild, in order to address those, we had to build a package and then ship that out. And of course, that took some time.
Yep.
With this update installed, it's an update for Vista and above, and it's an automatic updater of revoked certificates, just as the title says. So within a day of us finding out about a certificate that we need to put in an untrusted store someplace, we can essentially send you a quick blurb, and that will take the certificate and put it in that CTL, which we're calling a certificate trust list. And this is actually a backport of something that's coming in Windows 8. So this is great. This is new technology. The other thing that we're announcing yesterday is in August, we're going to release a change into how Windows manages certificates that have RSA keys of less than 1024 bits in length. So if you've got a key that's like, say, 512 in length, we're going to treat that certificate as invalid, even if it's currently signed and currently signed by a trusted certificate authority. So this is great news as well, and it's just kind of a natural progression. I mean, things change over time, so we look at the key lengths overall and say, you know what, less than 1024 bits, it's just come to a point where we don't really want to trust those as much anymore. That's
right. You know, we saw in the recent PKI issues we had, we released some advisories and whatnot last week. The key in question there was a 512-bit RSA key, so we saw a potential for a hash collision there, and we just... Man, we've got to move forward. We can't.
Right.
We should consider 512 keys not safe anymore. You know, we've got to move on to at least 1024, preferably 2048.
Right.
Yeah.
And we know that there's going to be some actions that administration have to take, so that's why we're announcing it a couple months ahead of time. So you can go ahead and make sure that all of your keys are the appropriate length that you require. And then in August, when we roll this out, we can go ahead and just have a smooth transition, and you won't get surprised by it.
You know, I think even back in, say, 2008 or so, there was a really big push from the certificate authorities to move up to a stronger key length. So I hope there will not be a great deal of pain here, but we've got to do it.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. So let's go ahead and talk about our detection and deployment slides, our nice bingo slide here, which actually this month doesn't look too bad. Everything is a nice big yes across the board, except for Dynamics AX, which we talked about before, being available through DLC only. And we have a couple of footnotes here, too. So for the Lync bulletin, so it's available on everything except for Lync 2010 attendee, which is a user-level install, and that's available on the Download Center as well.
But if you just use normal Lync like we do on CorpNet here, that messenger kind of thing, that all gets
taken
normally.
care of, service normally.
Yeah.
One thing to note is it doesn't send you a nice update, a nice little toast saying you're about to lose Lync.
Okay.
So if you try to update in the middle of running a Lync meeting, you're going to lose your Lync meeting. So that goes back to our best practices, though, of when you're going to apply updates, make sure you close all other running applications before you apply the updates. That really helps prevent issues from coming up. Okay, and if we look at what's next, our other update information, we have 3 bulletins, the .NET, Lync, and Dynamics, which may cause a restart. Everything else is going to cause a restart. Everything but the Dynamics AX is uninstallable, and we do have some bulletin replacement here. So what's interesting to note is the RDP bulletin this month is going to replace the MS-12 020 update from just last month. And .NET, as I said, has no replacement, and you can review the bulletins for all of the other in-depth replacement per each platform, because we really break it down.
So I guess the implication of that, if you haven't yet applied MS 12020, you can just apply the new RDP.
Just apply the new one,
right,
and you're protected against both for the platforms where it does replace 1220.
Okay. Great.
Yeah. And we have a couple of new families going into the MSRT this month. So we have Win32 Kleeman, which is a malicious program lacking the ability to propagate on its own. And Win32, that one, that's right, Kulos. It's always entertaining each month to figure out how to pronounce this stuff. And I know the MMPC blog will be blogging about the Kulos Trojan, and they'll go into much more detail for that. And as always, MSRT is available as a priority update through Windows Update or Microsoft Update. And it's offered through WSUS 3.0 as well. And the download is available at www.microsoft.com/malware remove.